What's up, everyone? This week on the pod, we are doing a roundtable discussion on punk and hardcore. It's super fun to just chop it up with some friends, talking about this wild music that we love. So stay tuned for that. And please support the podcast by subscribing to it wherever you listen to it. Also, please take the time to like it, rate it, and if you could leave a review, that would be awesome. It's been a while since there's been a review. It takes 30 seconds. And for whatever reason, that stuff matters for the pod getting traction. So you can just leave a quick review that says, this pod is awesome. And that would be much appreciated. If you'd like to go the extra mile, you can go to patreon.com/185 miles south and become a monthly Patreon. And we try to do a bonus podcast for basically any interview podcast that we do. So if someone gets interviewed, I bring on some friends and we chat about that podcast. We also go through the discography of the person. And those are some of my favorite podcasts. So check it out. And let's get on with the show.
"185 Miles South", a hardcore punk rock podcast.
What's up, everyone? This week on the pod, we're trying something new, and that's just talking about shit, which is really nice because we don't have to do any homework. We can just rely on our dearth of knowledge we've acquired over the years of liking this insane subgenre of music. So, yeah, we're going to talk about some topics and dig into them. And help me out. You know him. You love him. He's episode 1. He's the legend, Joe Rivas. What's up, Joe?
Hey, Happy New Year.
Also helping out, the author on the pod. I'm going to you before Daniel, so you can't steal your catchphrase. It is Ben Edge, a.k.a. Bedge, a.k.a. Ben Merlis. What's up, Ben?
What's going on?
There we go. a little getting back. And it's the most well-dressed man on the pod. It's Dan Sant. What's up, Dan?
Hey, man, what's going on?
Sound like that, Mike.
Yeah, so yeah, this I just wanted to do some topics here and dig into hardcore a bit because the second question that we ask is one that Ben asked me when he was interviewing me for episode 100, and I was talking about it and chatting with Ben. And I was like, man, I really want everyone else's opinion on this stuff. So whatever, I curated some questions, but to start off, this is a fun one that I've kicked around forever. And maybe it was a little more hypothetical before like the Misfits reunions, like before we were able to see like how many people the Misfits actually drew. But the question I'm posing to all you guys is, if Minor Threat did a reunion show and it's a $5 reunion show and you have 6 to 12 months notice, so there's no excuse. If you got plenty of warning, you can get it off work, you have a way to get there. Where do you do it, and how many people show up? Dan, what do you think about this?
I think the only answer that is valid is they would only do it as a political thing. So maybe like on the mall, like they've done in the past as Fugazi or something like that on the National Mall. Or, because I don't want to live in a world where more people go to a Have Heart reunion. No disrespect to Have Heart, but I don't want to live in a world where Minor Threat is outshined by that. But I also don't want to live in a world where Minor Threat play the Oakland Oracle and it's a stadium. Like, I don't want to live in that world, and I won't, because it's not going to happen. So I would think the only place to do it is in a protest manner, in an area where they just show up and it's like, all this money is going to this, and we are actually outside the thing we are demonstrating against.
Yeah, I didn't even think about doing it at the mall. That'd be wild, and that probably would be the most proper. And but how many people do you think show up?
God, 50,000.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's a conservative estimate. That's why it's like mind blowing to me, because everyone loves Minor Threat. Like every single person that like spent a year into punk or hardcore loves Minor Threat. You know, it's like a lot of people's first band, and you'd have like people flying from everywhere. You know, and yeah, you think about like the Have Heart show was what, 8,000 people. You know, yeah, and like yeah, they're big, but Minor Threat, dude. I don't know, Joe. What do you think about?
The thing is, it's like if you're not in the front 3 rows, like to be at the proper hardcore show, what does it? It just won't be the same. Even though it's Minor Threat, it'll still be a happening. But anyway, sorry. Ask Joe.
You can ask Joe.
What do you think, Joe?
Well, yeah, I mean, what you're saying is probably right, that it would be in the mall or Golden Gate Park or something like that, where it's not some sort of corporatized kind of thing. Although that's really Fugazi, because Ian doesn't call the shots in Minor Threat. It's like the whole band makes those decisions, so that might be a little bit different.
Yeah, but that being said, it doesn't mean he's going to go along with some idea.
I agree, but I would think that they would do it like maybe like when the Descendants did their return in 96 or 7, whenever that was, and sold out 8 nights, 10 nights, whatever it was at the Whiskey. I think they would do a small club thing like that, because they would want to basically, for
365 days.
Yeah, something like that, or like 5 nights in each kind of town in whatever the local
kind of like the Bikini Kill shows in a way.
800 to 1,200 capacity theater kind of thing that they would do.
I don't know. Then there's a bunch of people that wouldn't get in though, and that's why I like the idea of just doing it somewhere huge.
I agree that a lot of people would miss out, but that's the breaks.
Ben, what do you think? Go ahead, Dan.
It also, they don't want to be responsible for. I mean, this is so hypothetical because it never happened, but they don't want to be responsible for policing that many people and making sure things are safe, and trying to tell, what is it, like 30 to 40,000 people to not slam dance.
Yeah, I just can't imagine. Well, they wouldn't do that at that show, but I can't imagine like being, like at the mall. They would definitely have more people than Trump had at his inauguration, but
without a doubt.
But like, I can't imagine being like in the back, and having to watch Minor Threat on a screen like that. That would be fucking absurd.
Yeah, but 6 stage dive into the reflecting pool.
Yeah.
Fuck it. Ben, what's your take on this?
It's funny. I've thought about this for years, and my answer is the National Mall. And Minor Threat would actually perform on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, not on an actual stage. And 400,000 people would show up, because that's how many people showed up at the Million Man March in 1995, according to the National Park Service. So I figured Minor Threat could draw at least as many people as Louis Farrakhan. And then the next day, everyone will be like, Minor, who the fuck is this band? Everyone would have an Andy Rooney moment where they were like, I never heard of these guys. Why did they draw so many? And every hardcore kid in the world would say, fucking told you so. This is an important band. That's why so many people showed up.
Yeah, at the Million Man March, was that like as many as could fit? Were people like turned away due to space?
No.
You could do more.
According to Wikipedia, a conflict arose about crowd size estimates between march organizers and Park Service officials. National Park Service issued an estimate of 400,000 attendees, a number significantly lower than march organizers had hoped for. A heated exchange between leaders of the march and Park Service. ABC TV funded researchers at Boston University estimated the crowd size to be about 837,000 members with a 20% margin of error. It's a huge margin of error. So
yeah, but it just goes to the power structures of talking down Black achievement by them trying to downgrade as a national industry, trying to, paid by the government to downgrade the amount of people being there.
But what happened is they upgraded the amount of people because it got politicized. So they at first they said 400,000, and then they got heat on them, and they're like, okay, 837,000.
Yeah, but that's a different. You said that was a different agency. You said that was Boston University or whatever that had done.
No,
that.
You're right. ABC, you're right. Boston, ABC, Boston University. Anyway,
the Parks Department is a national, thing run by the government. They have a dog in the fight to try and downgrade Black achievement. So that's my
fair enough.
My take on
between
it.
400,000 and 900,000 showed up,
and that was that particular administration. That would be the Reagan administration. So.
No, the Clinton administration. This was 1995.
Oh, 95, that one. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it was great for Black people in 95. Just because old Slick Willie was playing a saxophone.
That's right. So I think Minor Threat could draw. And you know what? The National Park Service could underestimate the amount of people who showed up for Minor Threat. They could do that.
Yep.
All right, here's what I think. I think that, to be fair to everyone, and there's people scared to fly, you got to do it in the middle of the country somewhere. So I think you do it in Denver, Colorado, where the Broncos play. And then you have like some seating on the side, right? So it's like there are some older people that want to see the show. And so it's nice for them. And then you have the whole like football field for like the craziness. So I don't know what that holds. That's fuck. You know what though, Ben, you're right. I think that it's more than a football stadium. I think Minor Threat does over 100,000 people.
If it was at a football stadium, it would have to be the football stadium that the football team formerly known as the Washington Redskins play at, because that would be the local one.
Yeah.
There's no way in hell Minor Threat's playing anywhere other than DC.
I just think such an important part of hardcore is like the road trip, and driving to the show. And there's something I think would be rad about like just everyone converging on like a show in the middle of the country. Like, I think that would be so rad. But the mall's a spot, and Minor Threat draws 1 million people. How about that? Coming from all over this one, I think. Ben, so for this question that you proposed to me on episode 100, do you want to lay it out to the guys? Because it came a little better from you than how it looks written down.
Let's see. What did I say? How did I phrase it? Is that hardcore was invented on the West Coast, so why does it have to fight for respect? And I talked about this on episode 100 about how, hardcore's invented in LA County and Orange County in the very end of the 70s, and then it kind of spreads its way across the country. And then at some point, I mean, obviously DC was a huge deal just after that. But at some point, New York becomes the gold standard for hardcore, and it kind of just stays that way for the next 35 years, from probably about the mid 80s to now. And so I'm just wondering how that came to be, and why is the West Coast thought of as like kind of secondary to New York. So I don't know. Let's hear everyone's opinion on that.
Yeah, Daniel, what's your take on that?
I think it is not just punk hardcore. I think it's a societal thing where people view the West Coast as being easy living, in shorts most of the year, like just chill, blah, blah, blah. Whereas the East Coast view life as being harder. We got to shovel our driveways, blah, blah, blah. And then it comes down to the sports element as well, where West Coast teams aren't given their due compared to East Coast teams because ESPN is located on the East Coast. And it just comes down to an attitude of like, I mean, it is bolstered by some of the hardest hardcore records coming out of the East Coast in a very formative time for hardcore. So that is the spine that makes this bias happen. But I think it is just a a societal, sociological, subconscious view that life is harder and more crucial on the East Coast, where life is more laid back and a bit more easygoing on the West Coast.
Well, to add on to your point, Daniel, also there's a bigger conglomeration of large cities like put together where people view themselves as like being from different places there, right? Where California has a huge population, but it's kind of spread through all of California. And so you can kind of just either lump California together, or you can lump like NorCal, SoCal without like realizing that there's all these giant populations in different places. But
well,
the other thing,
it's also viewed that way from across the country, that California is LA and SF, and that's about it.
right. Ben, I think that a thing that would be helpful for this discussion would be, you say that hardcore was invented here. Can you like elaborate on some of the bands you're referring to?
I'm talking about the middle class who were from Santa Ana, I believe, and they put out, Out of Vogue in 1978 or beginning of 79, super fast hardcore record, even by today's standards, an extremely fast hardcore record. And then, Black Flag in the South Bay shortly after that. Circle Jerks a little bit after that with Group Sex. You have lots of and then Black Flag and Circle Jerks hit the road. They're like road dogs.
Well, I think that's a massive important factor when we discuss hardcore, because hardcore is not just music, it's not just lyrics, it's not just attitude. It is DIY and do it yourself. And Black Flag birthed that network of going across the country and showing people where they can stay, who they can hit up, making all these connections, and it became the absolute thing that is hardcore.
Right, but I think it's sonically like, okay, so middle class does a fast beat, but the majority of like Black Flag, Circle Jerks, and then all the orange, like the TSOLs, Adolescents, Agent Orange, like these bands, like they're more considered punk now, maybe because they're not doing like the fast beat. So I kind of wonder if, in most people's perspectives, like the birth of hardcore is like DC and then Boston right after, right? And New York. So it's like it really did start there in most people's brains.
Well, Bad Brains at CB's is what, 79?
Maybe a little later. They did
that video where they're all in like new wave kind of looking stuff, but they're still ripping.
Oh yeah, probably around that time. Yeah, I mean, great band, influenced by the Dickies from LA, by their own admission. But,
right. but making it faster than the Dickies.
But I totally.
It just depends on what you think sonically hardcore is like.
Right, and I think that's
maybe myself included. It's the fast beat,
Yeah, I actually think it's what is considered hardcore has evolved over the years, and it's evolved in a way that favors the East Coast, which is mosh parts, metallic, breakdowns,
But I'm not even talking mosh parts and tempo changes. I'm just saying like doing a faster tempo than Black Flag plays. So you have it Circle Jerks on Group Sex, but it's the last song, right? Like it's the red tape tempo, right? You don't get that as much. But you do get it when you go to DC, and then you have like SSD, DYS, like these bands coming out of Boston, and then you get them out of early New York.
But I don't think hardcore is just synonymous with speed. It's synonymous with aggression, the lack of melody, the attack, the in your face in the crowd parts that are less more performative as punk was. It's way more like, this is it. This is our 25-person scene, and we're going fucking mental.
No, I agree. Yeah. But I'm saying it is part of agreeing with what Ben says, that like it is shifted to the East Coast. Like definitely, like I think that would be a valid reason, is that people consider the birth, New York, Boston, DC, and
I think the LA, Orange County, end of the 70s, very beginning of the 80s bands we were talking about, they're like the transitional stage between punk and hardcore, like the missing link type bands. And I'm actually writing an article with a guy who used to write for Flipside back around that time about these bands. And it's completely, it's like, if you're a hardcore kid growing up after that time, you look at those bands as punk. And maybe if you're a punk rocker who was going to the Mask in 77, you look at those bands as like hardcore hooligans who ruin the whole scene. So it's like no one wants to claim them for their own scene. So they kind of fall through the crack. Obviously, like Adolescence and Circle Jerks and Black Flag are wildly popular. I think Black Flag gets respect on the East Coast, but in the context of punk.
But here's the thing: these bands were only labeled as punk post them being hardcore. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
As things got harder, then retroactively 5 to 10 years later, Black Flag is regarded as a punk band. But when Black Flag was around in its formative early years, it was hard as fuck and regarded as brutal hardcore.
Right. The goalpost has moved.
Yeah.
In a harder direction that favors the East Coast. But the same thing happened with hip hop, where it started in New York, and it went through a bunch of it went through this power struggle, and it ended up being the South dominating the sound of hip hop to this day for the last probably around 20 years. But like
the South's got something to say.
Yeah. So and like, I don't know what accounts for that. Like, that's a good question. That's not for me to answer because I don't have that much interest in Southern hip hop. But it's funny how things like that happen. Blues started in the South, and then the power base completely shifted to Chicago, and the blues became electrified. Decades on. So you can't. The people who invent something are almost like the sacrificial lamb for the people who thrive after the thing is off and running.
Well, and as we said on the pod, it ended up that way also, right? Like it ended up not that the power shifted to the South, but it ended up, I don't think that there's like an East Coast only power structure anymore. I mean, like I mentioned on 100, like one of the biggest hardcore bands, that band Knocked Loose, from Kentucky. You do have bigger California hardcore bands like Rotting Out. And if you look at Rotting Out in Ceremony, right, and Terror. And then if you look at some of the hype bands from 2020, Gulch, Drain, they're there. Things are spread out more.
Oh, I don't think that I don't think the statement is true per se. I think it's very hard for West Coast acts to get East Coast recognition in some arenas. But I think, like, if you're a good, hardworking band, regardless where you're from, the thing that to touch back on what you're saying is the East Coast seems to hold a lot more congregating in each other's scenes a lot more, because it is, Philly is close to New York, which is close to, Boston to an extent, all of these things. If there's a fest going on, you can easily go. Whereas, the length of California is like 3 times as long as any of those drives.
But right. The other thing it wasn't just bands from New York are bigger than bands not from New York. What I'm saying is New York controls the narrative. So you have bands that are from all over the country that are basically created themselves in the style of New York hardcore. In other words, if you're a New York hardcore sounding band from LA, New York still wins in that equation. Don't get it twisted. You're trying to be from New York. New York is controlling the narrative.
You're trying to sound like a band that wrote amazing music that came from New York. I don't think you're like aping the fact that you're from the Lower East Side or something.
Well, that's what I mean. The sound of hardcore is being defined by New York more than any other city.
Well, where did they get it from?
It's undeniable that like New York put out more great hardcore records than anywhere else.
Yeah.
Right.
Not well.
DC's close.
Mm.
DC's
Yeah,
close.
I don't know.
LA's good too, but
You guys
LA's
might,
really
you
good
guys
too,
might
so-
argue for DC, but New York's, of course.
New York's number one.
Yeah.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Okay. Well, fair enough. I mean, like,
Yeah.
Okay. So even maybe a naysayer, Ben, they're top 3, right?
Yeah. Yes, they're top 3.
I mean, like, for sure. And undeniable that like crosses multi generations with no fall off. And Joe, this is where I wanted to bring you in a bit because they're
I'm old.
well, right. A little bit, but also very fucking handsome. George Clooney-esque, maybe. But there is a California fall off in like the later 80s, right? Like this is when like straight edge hardcore is doing its thing and coming up. But what is like punk in California like in that 86 to 88 before Bad Religion Suffer comes out? Like,
Well, RKL. I mean,
how many people is RKL drawing in Los Angeles?
they're doing pretty good, I would think. I mean, 7 Seconds. Walk Together, Rock Together is 85, right?
Instead, Uniform Choice, and this is when
those are later.
Those Fenders shows and Olympic Auditorium shows are drawing like 4,000 people. Like,
Right, but
that's 87, 88.
The biggest crowds are for when the UK bands come out.
Yep.
It's like the biggest is when like GBH is playing.
And
The
speaking
UK
of which,
controlled the narrative.
Discharges started in Stoke-on-Trent in 1977. So I'm not sure some band from California releases a record in 79, how they're the first just hardcore band. I don't get that. I don't understand that.
Oh, because Discharge didn't sound like a hardcore band until 1980. You can listen to the demos on Spotify. They sound like a completely different band in the 70s.
They didn't sound like a hardcore band to you.
Uh-huh.
Oh,
right?
Ben?
Because this is all about perspective.
Yeah.
I think TSOL is a hardcore band. Someone from New York doesn't think that way. That's fine. That's their, and we allow this narrative to perpetuate that New York has the lock on this. I don't agree with that. I never have. We got this shit right here. It's good. It always has been. We've had great bands.
Yeah, no, I know, but like there weren't that many bands putting out great albums in 87. Right? Like 87 is a weird year for like the punk lane, right? Or maybe we should be saying the hardcore punk lane, right? Like Uniform Choice is like getting past their prime. Instead is raging. Fair enough. Final Conflict puts out a great LP, I believe, in 87. Mm-hmm. RKL puts out maybe their best LP in 87, but there's just not a ton of stuff. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, like all the Rev stuff is like popping, right?
Well, okay, so that's the difference is there's a label there to support them.
I mean, Epitaph here, but actually, I don't know what Epitaph was doing before Suffer. That's
exactly.
Like L7 records.
Exactly.
Okay. So, I mean, do we think it's just a lack of label support?
I think so.
There's plenty of labels. Like BYO is going, SST is still around. They're just SST is just shifting other stuff, right? And
right. Well, they're doing stoner rock, Soundgarden, and
go for it.
The thing that makes these things, it comes down to strange just instances of single people or duos, because if you look at it, Jordan is into these bands, collects all these different bands to put the things out. It then becomes a legendary label because all of this great sounding stuff is all on the same label. If SST, Greg Ginn, was into straightforward blazing hardcore at the time, he quite possibly could have gathered many bands that sounded like that were around at the time, to put together. But Greg Ginn was into experimental stoner shit, so SST traveled along that route, you know?
Well, also in New York, in LA, we had a head start on New York, and there was this period by 87 or so where, you know, things might cool off a little bit, and then in New York, or at least evolve into things that we don't identify as hardcore anymore. And then in New York, you kind of have the same thing in the early 90s, you know, a little later on, since you know, 6 or 7 or 8 years after the scene really gets going, you have Rev putting out, of course, Rev is, but at this point, an Orange County label, but Rev putting out all these kind of post-hardcore bands, and you know, Quicksand being a huge deal, and ABC No Rio, and things that are not straight ahead hardcore anymore. Like that just happened for LA earlier, with, you know, TSOL getting weird in 83 with Beneath the Shadows or whatever.
Beneath the Shadows,
yeah. So so every scene has that period of like, okay, we did the digga straight ahead stuff. Now what do we do next? We're bored. Let's try different things. And it just happened earlier for LA because LA started earlier.
Well, and it happened earlier for DC as well.
Because DC started earlier. I mean, marginally than New York.
Right. The other thing that I think is for California, you know, post Suffer, you have Suffer that like inspires like an entire scene, you know, and No Effects, like, you know, being inspired by RKL, and No Effects like getting good, and these bands, and then Fat Records and Epitaph like getting started in the early 90s, and then punk blowing up. I think that a lot of California gets lumped in to like that new school Epitaph sound, right? Which is like a fully different thing, like that, the punk explosion, right? And Warped Tour and the Green Days and the Offsprings and so forth. So it like kind of like diverges even further from like hardcore.
Totally. Yep. And that's interesting. We talked about this on another episode, like Bad Religion, Suffer, and No Control are, like, technically speaking, melodic hardcore records, but the influence is not felt in the hardcore scene. It's in this next generation of kind of Epitaph, Fat Records.
What?
Well, no, I'm talking about like Bad Religion being a huge influence on, you know, Pennywise, No Effects, No Use for a Name, those kind of bands, as opposed to like more traditional hardcore bands. Even though Bad Religion is a melodic hardcore band, their influence is more on the bands on Fat Records and Epitaph.
Yeah.
Joe,
if Zoli sounded like Brett, I mean, like Greg, that's Ignite would be Bad Religion.
Oh yeah, I think of Ignite as more Uniform Choice influence, but then they get kind of more melodic as the years go on. But like, you know, a band like Pennywise, which is clearly Bad Religion Jr., you know?
Yes, Bad Religion mixed with like a little bit of speed metal. Yeah, I remember like reading something a long time ago that I thought was interesting, which was someone was saying like Screeching Weasel was such a huge influence on pop punk, but like the bands, they took like the silly songs and they didn't take like the smart songs. And they thought that was like such a tragedy, you know, that like, because some Screeching Weasel songs have great lyrics, like The Science of Myth, you know, and like what would have happened if like pop punk went that way, you know, taking the smart stuff instead of like the bubblegummy type stuff. But that's maybe another topic for another day. But I actually agree with Ben here a bit that the Bad Religion Suffer, it influenced like that Epitaph stuff more, like the stuff that's in the punk lane. Like, I don't know if I don't know. I guess like that would be a question. What melodic hardcore bands in the 90s are we thinking of? You know, and where do we draw their influence from? What are the most popular melodic hardcore bands in the 90s?
Well, I have a great story that kind of almost disproves my point, but not totally. Yeah, on the Where It Went podcast, which I recommend everyone listen to.
Shout out.
Friend of the pod, Greg Pollard, is one of the three hosts of the show. They interviewed some of the guys from Gorilla Biscuits, and Walter met Civ at a skate spot in Queens, and Civ was singing "We're Only Gonna Die" by Bad Religion to himself, and Walter was like, "This guy's a really good singer," and that's how he picked him to be the singer of the band. And so, in a very, very roundabout, convoluted way, Bad Religion has something to do with Gorilla Biscuits, who are like sort of the, peak melodic hardcore, East Coast melodic hardcore band of all time. So, but in general, I'd say Bad Religion, their influences felt much more greatly in the kind of Warped Tour, Epitaph, Fat sort of West Coast centric scene.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that could lead us into our next question that I had, which is just defining like what is new school punk and what is like pop punk and what is a band like Lifetime. I think that's so interesting, like breaking these things out. To shout out to another podcast, most people listen to Axe to Grind as well. And they were talking about metalcore in some episode. And I was begging for them to like give a definition of like what they consider metalcore. Cause I don't even know like what is considered metalcore, because it's another thing kind of like these things that is such perspective of what you call it. Like, I don't know if there's a agreed upon definition. So I'm always curious of people's opinions. But Ben, what do you think differentiates like these things?
From pop punk from new school?
Yeah. And then also like, what is a band like Lifetime?
It's funny. I hadn't heard the term new school since the 90s. And now, of course, ironically, what you're talking about, like most of those kind of Fat Records bands, that they're not new anymore, but I guess they're new school. Lifetime, I always thought of as like sort of the middle point between hardcore and melodic punk, which is the space that Gorilla Biscuits also occupies. But Lifetime to me still has more of a hardcore feel to them than your standard Lagwagon, for example. I'm sorry, I'm using them as an example. I no use for a name, whatever, what have you. I can definitely tell. Like, I mean, we're not even talking about early Lifetime. That's just
No. Talking about like the last two LPs pre-breakup.
Right. Even if I had heard those without knowing anything about the band, I think I would be able to tell, like, oh, these are hardcore kids playing this music.
I just think that like even a band like No Use for a Name they have more attack in the vocals than Lifetime does. I think that Lifetime, the vocals like lean more towards like a pop punk than a band like No Use for a Name or 80 Fingers Louie.
Right, but the vocals are only one element of a band, right?
That's fair. That's fair.
Like either 1/4 or 1/5. Even though your average listener of music, I think, gives more weight to vocals than every other instrument put together. But then when you get into playing music yourself, I think you can, treat every element more equally.
But they're not equal, dude. The vocals are more important because, like, take either of those bands, No Use for a Name or Lifetime, and have, Glenn Benton from Deicide singing on them. Like, what is that?
Changes everything.
Like there's certain extremities in the vocals that like make something. Although who knows what the fuck that would be.
But I mean, take a Lifetime song and make every beat halftime. Like that would completely fucking change everything too. And that's the drums.
Fair. That's totally fair. Joe, what's your take on this? Like what differentiates like pop punk from like that Epitaph Fat Record stuff? And then where do you consider a band like Lifetime?
Well, I'll start with Lifetime. I would just say that they're a post-hardcore band. Like Ben said, you can definitely tell that they were hardcore kids, and they all were. that gets a little tricky though, because you could say like, well, so does Moby sound like a hardcore band? You know,
Yeah,
can you tell that he was a hardcore kid? No, because
right.
it's totally
Like post-hardcore, I always think of like being slower, where Lifetime was fast.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on when in Lifetime's career we're talking about as well too. Are we talking background and
No. We're talking Jersey's Best Dancers and Hella
Jersey's Best, right? So by then they got influenced by what was happening on the West Coast with all the new school stuff. So, and altered their sound a bit. Probably from like Star 69 stuff on is when they started to change. Adding more melody instead of the heavier, the stuff that's on background per se. What
happened was the singer and the bass player lived together. In the summer '94, they listened to 24 Hour Revenge Therapy every single day, and that was a huge influence. I think you hear it mostly in the lyrics, but think about 24 Hour Revenge Therapy and then make the beat harder and faster, and it's pretty close. It's getting there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Daniel, what's your take?
It comes down to taste level and the formation of where you come from. The thing that makes Lifetime different is they grew up in basement shows that were regimented hardcore spaces. Do you know what I mean? Whereas a lot of these new school / surf punk bands grew up in a different space, a Golden Voice show arena. Not saying arenas, but I'm saying in space where shows were being put on by Golden Voice. You were getting tickets through Ticketmaster and things like that.
There's a barrier.
Yeah, there's a barrier. There's a whole different interaction with the crowd. There is a difference between the crowd and the band, whereas in the places Lifetime grew up and started playing, and a lot of these other things like Game Face and whatnot, even though that that's a poppy version on the West Coast, that is very different than the Fat Records Epitaph bands. Even though the sound may be kind of similar, it's just because they grew up at, say, like a Fenders, or not even Fenders, like a Spankies or something, So that formation of who they were as hardcore kids somewhat lends just an intangible way that the music is going to come out sounding compared to, everybody liking Bad Religion and trying to push that genre with the triggered drums and the do that, do that. I can't even say it. That kind of thing, and being on skate videos or STV or whatever. It's just a different world. Like, it's why, there's those of us who've liked everything, but the majority of that stuff that we liked when we were getting into it and coming up, we've left most of it behind. But something like as urgent and as heartfelt and as no bullshit as a Lifetime or something like that has maintained and has longevity, because there appears to be less fluff and more heart upon looking back at it all. And that's not to say that No Use for a Name didn't, write heartfelt songs that are very political and things like that. It just, by aligning yourself in that scene, it just doesn't have the same modicum of truth to me.
Right, like in the Warped Tour world.
Yeah.
And Lifetime was a huge influence on pop punk, especially in the 2000s. But we can't use those standards to go retroactively judge Lifetime as a pop punk band.
Yeah.
Well, that's what you guys just did with hardcore.
Yeah, well, that's what
I'm complaining about other people doing it. I don't do it.
by by the 90s, like a lot of music is just whatever label you want to slap on it anyway, and like what scene you're playing on,
by
what scene you're playing in, right?
Right.
Yeah. Like, I mean, if you think about what gets considered under the hardcore umbrella in the 90s, it's really big.
Right.
It's not all a sonic thing, and I think it would be the same for what gets considered like punk and so forth.
Well, I think a lot of that new school stuff gets the bad rap as well because of the major marketing that got behind them. That Epitaph and Fat Records pushed, which the surf videos and all that stuff you guys just talked about, Warped Tour, all that stuff had a bad taste in old school guys' mouths. Like Tony's. I was going to use Tony, and he loves all of those bands, but Ill Repute never got nothing, and now here's Good Riddance that owes everything they do to those old bands. Blast, let's use Blast. So Clifford gets nothing, and Russ gets everything. So there's a bad taste in the mouth of those guys that they were never paid, I guess. Not that it's all about money, but it certainly helps. And then you throw in what also was happening heavily in the 90s is all the crust stuff. So you have all the Profane Existence people going, oh, that's not even hardcore at all, or punk or anything. So you have that battle going on too. And then it doesn't help with people like, Heart Attack with their, stringent doctrine that they put forth. So I don't know what I'm saying.
Yeah, well,
no, but that makes sense.
It's a good point.
Makes sense.
It's that there's a lot of bands that are doing well in like that popular lane, and then there's a bunch of naysayers from all sides.
Yeah,
right? Like the crustier punk, the more political punk and hardcore, and then also like the old school that's like a little bitter about stuff getting popular when they didn't necessarily have their due.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that Clifford or Tony or any of those guys are bitter, but guys on the periphery, like maybe Tony's friend is like, you guys it should have been you guys, not them, not these new kids. What do they know? They didn't suffer like we did, like all that stuff,
Yeah, that's fair. And then maybe that also like plays into why some of that stuff doesn't have like the, it doesn't seem like it holds up as well in hindsight to a lot of people. And maybe that's why, is that like people think that they had everything like in their hands, right? So then when something gets less popular, it doesn't get as much sympathy because like it really was like the shit for a while.
Yeah.
But it's also like
people were rooting for it to fail. So when it finally goes away, they're like, finally.
Yeah,
I miss that.
The other reason it's retrospectively derided is because it's kind of like the My First Punk Band starter kit for a lot of people who grew up in the 90s. And so people got into these bands when they were 13 or 14 and just discovering punk, and then they promptly grew out of it. And so they're like, oh, that band, I liked them when I was 13. Like there's something about it it was marketed towards young teens, the whole Warped Tour thing. And like, there's just certain bands people tend to grow out of, and then they don't look at them as adults with the same sort of, like, I liked Guttermouth when I was 14. I can't listen to a Guttermouth record anymore. But then again, I also like Bad Religion, and I still love Bad Religion. So
yeah,
some of that stuff just doesn't hold up though. Like, let's not kid ourselves.
That's a great example.
I think that no Use for a Name. Okay, maybe you like No Use for a Name. Of course you do, Zach. But like, go down the roster of Epitaph and Fat circa 95, 96. Don't tell me every one of those bands holds up. You know?
But
like,
and I'm also
there's a
like,
thing here.
Before I shoot it to you, like, I just want to say, like, you have a point there, Ben, because I don't even ride for the whole No Use for a Name catalog. Like, I literally love one album,
Right.
So like, I'm not even going beyond that. Daniel, sorry.
I was just saying, there's an element when you're getting into this stuff and you're discovering that kind of stuff. There's tons of people who never grew out of it, that this stuff sounds the best to them. But a lot of people, this is their formula gateway into punk and hardcore, right? And so when you start listening to it, you're gathering everything, like, especially pre-internet, this is way before Spotify. You're just like a basking shark, like inhaling all the things. Oh, this is on Fat too. I'm going to listen to that. Oh, this is on Epitaph. Let me check that out. Oh, Nitro's supposedly a good record label like this. Let me check stuff out there. Right. But then you realize, wow, there's only like 3 bands worth keeping out of all of this. And you move on, you keep those things with you, but then you discover something like Bad Brains and you're like, oh my God, this, and there's certain things that you just can't put your finger on it to explain it, but you just know, no, this is real. That other stuff is not.
Well, and I think that Lifetime is a good one to touch on because Daniel, you did a good job of explaining maybe like what that intangible value is, right? I mean, like that's a band that the 4 of us talking here tonight all like. And, sonically, yeah, it's all good, but what is it about that band that makes it special? I don't know. I think that is just like one of those intangible things you can't put your finger on. We could break it down sonically and figure it out, but it's not that. It's like a combination of like multiple things.
Well, when I first got that Hello Bastards album, I had already pretty much drifted away completely from those Epitaph Fat bands. You know what? I never really liked that many of those Epitaph Fat bands in the first place. I wouldn't say I sold all my, Lagwagon records because I never had a Lagwagon record. But like Guttermouth, perfect example. I know they're not on either of those labels, but like by early 96, when I got Hello Bastards, I had pretty much given up on them. And like, I was listening to all these straight edge bands and hoping like, hey, I still like fast music. And that was an era where there were very few straight edge bands or bands in the hardcore scene, in quotes, playing fast music. And that album was like a breath of fresh air. Like, oh God, like it was like a great exhale. Like, oh, finally someone in the hardcore scene playing fast and fun music. Like, thank God, like more of this, please. And that was where I was at that point in mid 90s. And that's what made it so great, at least at that point in time. Yeah, and it wasn't like Guttermouth Part 2. It was like there was substance to it and it was much better music and it was still fast and it was fun.
Yeah, I mean, Guttermouth is just a terrible band.
Terrible band.
I do love the song on Cinema Beer Goggles, but I saw them a couple years ago and they were so bad, dude. So bad. I think that what they were is for like the people that were into all that, like the new school stuff, they did sound a little bit more raw and the singer was pretty intense live at the time. So I think that might have been some of the appeal, what do you think, Joe?
Well, I was just going to say they provided the, I'm going to try to be political on this. No, fuck it. They're providing the TV punk rock version of punk.
I thought they were a continuation of the Vandals. I thought the Vandals were still around at that point as well. So you had 2 really popular, goofy punk bands.
Yeah, they're kind of in that lane.
That's what I mean.
Pretty aggressive, still pretty aggressive, and a little less melodic.
That's what I was trying to get at. That they just provided that, the safe rebellion version, because you could find real rebellion in the mid 90s in hardcore, in punk, in thrash, and everything. But here was this packaged version of it that wasn't as you weren't going to lose an eye to them,
right?
You know
you had to peel down another layer to get to like the real shit, and
you felt like a bad boy, but you weren't really.
Right. But pre-internet, it would be hard to find some of the, like, you know, I guess you can go through zines and like take a guess on like what profane existence band is good. But if you're a teenager, you know, and you have very limited finances for what you can buy, you know, what CD do you buy out of that catalog? You know, if they're listing like 20 releases,
Right.
you know, how do you know if you don't have someone to like tell you what's good?
The one in collegiate font with the X's on both sides of the name.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's how we got all that great, like third rate stuff, you know, several years later. But, you know, in 95 to like, if you're like, I like this Guttermouth shit, I want some realer shit than Guttermouth. Like, I don't know how you find it, you know, if you don't have someone kind of showing you the way.
Yeah, but that's usually you do.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, but not if you're just some kid that is going to work.
I suppose you're right. We're
from a very fortunate area, Joe, where like it's steeped in history and like local shows, and there are like
old guys like me
still
around. Yeah,
you know, to show you, you know. But if you're just a dude that grew up like, I don't know, I guess there's always going to be like an older punk dude, but also like people aren't always nice. You know, like we're also fortunate that like the older people from our area were relatively like nice to younger people, you know, and I hope
also,
that we do that still.
You're also fortunate that the older people in your area had good taste, because what if you were around a bunch of older people that are telling you like, no, this Guttermouth potty humor shit is the pinnacle of punk, you know? Then you're only going to be turned on to more garbage.
I've been around since 78, and trust me, Guttermouth is the apex of punk. It doesn't. I've been waiting for this band to come along my whole fucking life, and it's finally here.
That's part of what. Wait, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I will say that Mark from Guttermouth is a really nice guy. So
yep, he was a great guy. He you know, like we traded phone numbers when I saw them at Spanky's in '92 with Face to Face, and like. We would talk to each other on the phone for hours, and I was just like a kid, you know, a little like a 14-year-old, a high voice. It's like, and he was like a 26-year-old grown ass man, and like there was nothing creepy. I know people love to say, "Oh, that's so creepy." It's like, no, he was a nice guy. Like that's all there is to it. And there's another thing you wanted to talk about, Zach, that differentiating pop punk from new school. Like how would you differentiate those two, break those two into two different categories?
Do you have an opinion?
I completely forgot about the term new school until you brought it up last week, because I was calling it all pop punk, and my friend goes, Offspring isn't pop punk. What makes that pop punk? And I'm like, you're right.
Yeah.
Like Green Day's pop punk, right?
Yeah.
Green Day's pop punk.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe it's something that doesn't matter at all. I've always thought that like, yeah, Green Day's in a little bit different of a lane than like NoFX.
Are they?
Maybe they're not. Maybe I'm wrong, and that's the whole like. This topic is like there is no difference between pop punk and new school.
Yeah, I don't think there is, because they're all searching for pop melodies within the framework of punk. That's what makes
so were the Ramones.
Yeah. They
Right?
just happen to be punk because of the magazine, the zine, that the scene like was coined as punk.
Yeah.
Or the Ramones would have just been like a rock and roll band. They
Right, that's true.
You know.
Well, they sounded different enough than anything else that came before them that I think the fact that there was a new term to describe them is completely warranted, you know? Like no one sounded like the Ramones before the Ramones.
Well, I don't know.
Like that, with the beat.
Yeah, not with that aggression. Yeah.
Down pick guitar, like nah.
But what I'm saying is, on a post, like you can't go back to coin. They were just being coined punk, so you can't call it pop punk at the same time, because there's nothing else that was punk to differentiate it against. What I'm saying is, when punk and hardcore and all of these other strains within are well known, it starts to become a genre defined as pop punk, because you're searching for the melody being the most important part of what your song is written, how it's written, the backups, the texturing of vocals, the searching for pop hooks within punk is what makes it pop punk, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I got you.
Is it possible though, Dan, to be a melodic punk band but not be a pop punk band? Here's an example: Jawbreaker. I don't know if you'd even call them a punk band, but like, is it possible to be melodic punk but not be pop punk?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I would. A lot of what is being described here as new school, as for the sake of this argument, in my past and my knowledge, has either been referred to as melodic punk or pop punk. You know, like some of the bands that didn't necessarily want the success or didn't get to be in the lane of success were more referred to as melodic punk because they didn't have the popularity that comes with pop punk, you know?
Yeah, but like a band like Naked Ray Gun or a band like Pegboy, like they're definitely, both those bands are melodic. There's no denying that. They're both punk bands. There's no denying that. But they're completely like outside of the whole Epitaph Fat Records California sound, like completely not the same thing at all. And I know a lot of, maybe Pegboy had crossover appeal to the kind of person who would listen to NoFX in the 90s, but I just wouldn't call those bands pop punk.
Agreed, but pop punk also is the name of a genre that kind of rose up around, I don't know, Green Day's career, essentially.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
I guess I always associate pop punk with like kind of like that vocal, like kind of like the snotty vocal, I guess. I don't know. It's hard to explain. Yeah,
the nasal singing.
It was easier in my head.
The nasal singing, like the first band I think of is NoFX when I think of pop punk.
Yeah, and then but that's the thing is like I think new school when I think of like that Ryan Green overproduced like melodic sound. So and pop punk didn't have like that. You know, it's just a little different. And also pop punk was always kind of like mid tempo in my head, not fast. So I don't know. Maybe it's all like fucking same.
It's all basically the Descendants, but worse. You know what I mean? Like Descendants are too good to be a pop punk band. Like they're too good. Like you can't call them a pop punk because they're just above it.
Maybe that's fair. Okay, now to a question that is inevitably going to make us sound all like a bunch of fucking fossils. Is punk and hardcore no longer rebellious? And if that's the case, what could make it rebellious again? I'm going to go first, so I set the tone as not being a fossil. Ben proposed this question, and I realized that I think I'm the only guy in this little round table that would have like started going to shows post like punk's huge popularity. So like if you're going to pose this question, it actually has to be to someone that would be like older than me. Like I'm, you know, what year does Green Day break? 94 or something? 93?
4 is when Dookie came out.
Okay. Right. And so like I got into Bad Religion in like probably 92 or 93. Right. So like just right before it, but I'm not going to shows until I'm after 14. So punk's big, you know? And so like, if we're going to talk about it never being rebellious, like that would be like the least rebellious era ever, you know, when it's like at its absolute peak. So, and we all found something in this subgenre of music that we felt was rebellious because we've lived it our entire lives. Right. And so like, maybe you guys all found it before that. So you're more real, but I don't consider that. Like, I think that I'm just as into it as all you guys. And I also think that like, you know, the hardcore is like more multicultural now than like ever, which is awesome, which means like more topics are being approached, more people are being represented, and like that is an awesome lane of rebellion. So I think that I don't know. I think it's better than ever, personally. You know, while like, you know, Benny might be in love with like the 81 sound more than anything. Like, as far as like bands pushing the genres within this like scene, I think it's just as rebellious now as it's ever been. You know,
right?
What do you think?
Me?
Yeah.
I think it like before that explosion of Green Day, Offspring, Rancid in '94, like it was like if you were an average American person, you were, under the age of, I don't know, 30, you didn't know that punk ever existed. Like it was completely underground, and to the point where like I hear stories about people walking around in the late '70s, punk rockers, and then a Camaro pulls up and like guys with long hair and Led Zeppelin baseball shirts call them Devo F-bomb and like throw crap at them. Like people were yelling stuff at me, but they didn't even know who Devo was anymore. Like this shit was wiped off the map. There's an inherent rebellion in something that is going to invite that kind of heat on you. And once that heat is lifted, and I do think it's a good thing that people don't yell shit at each other anymore because they have pink hair. Like society has progressed in a positive direction, at least in that respect. Like now looking punk or being punk is no longer inherently rebellious. You have to do something rebellious. You have to say something rebellious in order to be rebellious. So no longer have that inherent rebellion. And like the thing about like nowadays, if you have, I think of it like a band in 2020 who's, I don't know, going out and marching in the street and I can't think of great examples of that, but let's say all the political boxes are checked. I just think of that as a punk band that also happens to be rebellious. You know what I mean? It's like, you happen to be wearing a t-shirt and a hat at the same time. The two things are not intrinsically linked to each other. Like you are punk and you are also rebellious. Like,
no, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. But like also when you look at like the popularity of some of those shows in the 80s, like going to the Olympic or like going to Fenders or going to the country club, and thinking about like a band, like instead drawing like 600 people, you know what I mean? Or however, Joe, how many people are they drawing? 600, 800? What?
I mean, they would sell out
so what's the cap?
1,200.
Okay. Dude, I haven't gone to that many shows that have ever drawn that many fucking people. Like, and I've been into punk and hardcore for 25 years. You know what I mean? So like, that's the part that gets a little confusing with, acting like it's bigger now than it was before or something. Like, I don't know. I that would be so ill to go see GBH and like have 3,000 people be there. Like,
but I don't. The term punk and the idea like, oh, punk rock, spiky hair, fast music, that idea is implanted, is more well known and widespread than it was back then. Your average normal ass person is more likely to know what punk is now than back then, even though there were punk shows that were drawing 1,200 people.
Fair enough.
But those shows were few and far between. So when they showed up, when the show occurred, everybody went from the entire area. So it's not the same thing as, as the punk explosion occurred and there's 10,000 bands and now nobody goes because there's 10,000 bands, so you get 6 people at your show because you're splitting it amongst the other 20 shows that are happening that same night. You know what I mean?
Right. Everyone started a band and fucked it up for everyone else, but there's still the same number of people, I suppose.
Yeah, or I mean, it may have increased along with it, the standard population increase, but
are you guys aware of Pussy Riot? You know about this band, Pussy Riot?
Yeah,
I watched the documentary.
Yeah, so I mean, to me, what they were doing in 2012, it at least on an ethical level, like you can't get more punk than that. Like they went to prison for years because they were a punk band that stood up for, LGBT rights. They opposed Putin, who's a dictator, and they got thrown in prison. And like when this was happening, I was like, oh my God, the most punk band that ever existed is happening right now. Like I can't believe this. Like because even at that point, that's only 8 years ago. Like the idea of punk being rebellious seemed like a distant memory.
It was just as much performance art as it was rebellious, though.
Yeah.
Right. Did they have a drummer?
Well, that's the thing. Like, I don't really I listened to some of their music like just before we started recording this, and it's like, I guess the early stuff kind of sounds like Le Tigre and but now it's like definitely not identifiable as punk music at all.
Well, here's the thing. Here's what I have to say about this. First and foremost, I don't agree that punk has ever lost anything rebellious. And I definitely don't agree that punk was not known by most conclaves of society. I think punk has always been, since it has been a thing, has always been known. Maybe you didn't know a punk per se, but you knew what it was. You knew it was a subgenre of music that had a rebellious streak. The thing is, the punk scene has always, since its inception, had people at shows that were rebellious and were sharing ideas and were agitators and were doing things, and still to this day. And it has always had people in the crowd that also didn't give a fuck about that and were there for loud extreme music, and that was it. You know, and punk has done amazing things rebelling against itself. Straight edge. The lyrics are rebelling against a stereotype of what a punk is, and it's rebellion within, it's self-commentary. Punk will always be rebellious, but it will also have strands that are watered down and arguably just musically based things. Punk as an idea is always rebellion. Punk as a genre contains many, many different things.
That's fair, because everyone would have heard of the Sex Pistols at least, right, Ben? Most people just.
Well, I'm talking about
punk was a thing that died. Like, it didn't exist in the 80s to like a normal person, maybe.
Well, I mean, like,
it's always like Quincy. It was on Quincy. It was on
Chips.
Yeah, exactly. It always was known by society.
We will never.
And Star Trek. What year was the Star Trek movie?
That's Star Trek 4, the Return Home.
Search for Spock, yeah.
No, it's the Return Home. He's on a San Francisco bus. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you can't quantify something that has so many streams and strains and layers as boiling it down to one thing. It just doesn't work, and that is almost not punk to think of punk that way.
Yeah, I always thought it was kind of funny, like when I got into it, because liking a lot of that Epitaph Fat stuff, and then you'd have like the crusty punks that were like my age or younger, and like looking down on us, like, well, who the fuck are you? Like, we got into this at the same time. You know what I mean? Like, you don't know better than me. You just have different friends.
Well, and to go off the people rolling up in a T-Bird to beat your ass because you got pink hair. I mean, that's just adolescence in a very patriarchal, macho society. Like, I was walking down the street growing up in England and just not looking at a group of 3 boys on the other side of the street, because if you made eye contact, you were getting your ass beat regardless of what you looked like. It's just a thing that happens. Punk just gave them an excuse for, like, we can recognize those people really easily. Let's go get them.
Joe, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what in a roundabout way, we're talking shit. No, I just lost my train of thought because I was listening to Daniel and I was looking up the lyrics for Macho Insecurity, because that's pretty much what he just kind of was talking about. So, from the Dead Kennedys.
Yeah, I mean, I can just also elaborate while you think, Joe.
Yeah.
Like, there's not another genre of music that I could do the lyrics that I do in, right? And like, that's my shit. Like, I love writing lyrics. And I couldn't do them in any other genre of music.
No,
So-
I mean, there's political hip hop. I mean, you listen to a lot of political hip hop.
That's true, but I don't want to write that many bars in a song.
Well, I mean, the overall point is there are rebellious lyrics in other genres of music as well.
Yeah,
I know, but I'm too dumb for that lane. So like this is the only lane that works for my shit.
Even in radio friendly music, there's rebellion music in there too. So
Sure. But I couldn't do Shut Your Face on the radio. Although that is like, I think the only song with no cussing on the Retaliate record. It's the only song that could be on the radio. Fuck. Joe, did you want to wrap up this segment?
no, go for it.
Okay, let's move on.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to talk about that kind of ties into that is just, do lyrics matter the least in this era than they ever did? And that's not like saying the lyrics have gotten worse or music is more Neanderthal. It's more so just like a technology thing. Thinking about the way that we consume music, because the majority of people consume music digitally now. Like, I still buy physical music, but if I was going to compare the time that I spent listening to records to listening to music digitally still wins, probably. Right. And there's a bunch of people out there that just consume music digitally. And so you're not like getting a physical piece and opening it up and having the lyric sheet be there or having the credits be there. And so I just wonder if not the band's output, but to the listeners in general, do lyrics matter less now? And like, what do we think about that? And what do we do about it? Daniel, do you have a take on this?
I would say no. I would say that they matter just as much as they ever have. If you're listening to something digitally and you are singing along and you're really liking it, and especially if it is message-based music and you are listening along, there's a thing called Google, and the same digital aspect that you're using to listen to the music, you're going to use to look up the lyrics for most things on Bandcamp or whatnot. The thing is, the lyrics may be less accessible in this day and age, but they don't matter less. They matter just as much. There are as many bands, and especially as the underground and the youth push society to be better, to get better, to be more inclusive, to strive for justice, even more in the last 5 years than, we could arguably say in the last 20 before it. These kind of messages have become more and more important and more shared. So, the accessibility might be less, but the importance is just as much as ever.
Well, I 100% agree on the importance. And I think that in this genre, the lyrics have never been better, like well-written wise. Mostly, well, not mostly, but a reason for that would be that a lot of hardcore is like the hooks. And so a lot of like the tropes have been taken, and can't all be recycled. So people have to push the boundaries artistically, however they want to do that.
Well, art is like that regardless. There are themes that come and go, like the Baroque period versus the Romantics versus the Renaissance. If we're talking about art on a level like that, it's just because a group of people pushed each other further to make things forward. So right now, like you say, there's a absolutely wonderful spot for lyrics. Well, all the bands that are participating in these scenes are taking influence from each other and pushing further and demanding more, and the people who are listening are demanding more. It's a wonderful, spring of ideas that are just going to get better and better as people push forward and push for more.
Yeah, this is just something I thought about because, the Retaliate record got delayed, at the plant for like whatever 2 weeks. It wasn't even a bad delay, but it got released digitally, and it took a couple weeks for people to get the records after. And you can't always understand what I say, and I take my lyrics really seriously, and I wanted all these people to like know what I was saying. And I just wish that like there was something, in Spotify that was integrated that like, like the lyrics can appear or something.
Yeah, I think you're pushing for an addition to the way that most people like either Apple Music or Spotify will use those two places to listen to a lot of their music. You're pushing for them to integrate what happens on a Bandcamp or something like that to be within their program.
Well, and I think that it's going to go that way because Spotify, to get your music on there, you actually have to submit all your lyrics. So they have them. It's probably something they're working on, but I just wish that it was a little like more upfront, and
that's a massive thing to retroactively go through and add all the lyrics. Do you know what I mean?
100%. I'm just, for the mass populace of people that are consuming music now, it's just different than when you bought an LP or a CD and it was there. And like, that's kind of like an immersion that you have, right? Like you unpackage the CD or the LP and you put it on the player. And then when you listen to it for at least the first 5 minutes, you kind of just peruse what the package is.
Yeah.
And if you're separating, like if you're taking that experience out, I think that there is a huge chunk of listeners that are never going to like take that step.
But if you're gonna look at the experience being different on just that level, you have to take into account the experience being different everywhere, because back then we would open an LP, we would put it on and we would pore over the lyrics while listening to it. Right now, many, many, many people will put on a song and then let it take them to another song and to another song of different bands, and let the algorithm take over. Or some people won't even let the song finish. There's that kind of attention span that's happening sometimes. Like I work with a person that doesn't even finish a song. He's already, I got to put this one on next. So, he's so excited about playing all this music, but he's not actually listening to any of it.
That's why I don't smoke weed anymore. That's what I would do. I would like sit there on my fucking laptop and listen to 30 seconds of every song.
Yeah. Yeah. So I should drug test him then.
Ben, do you have on this?
Yeah, I was wondering, Zach, did you put the lyrics to the new Retaliate album on Bandcamp?
No, so that's something I got to figure out.
I think Dave puts it up on the Indecision Bandcamp for all the bands, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
but
I'm not really sure.
There.
This is just something I thought about, like, today for doing this. I didn't go research. And
the lyrics are not there on Bandcamp. That's why I asked you the other day for the lyrics. For episode 1. Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah. I was going to ask you for the lyrics, but I knew I was going to buy the record. So I just bought the record and now I have the lyrics.
Joe just wanted to see if he was name dropped as well as mentioned in the title.
I'm the song title, but I'm going to get a shout out in the song.
Right. Well, where's my fuck?
No, I know. So like, I'll work on getting all that integrated. That's like, I don't know. It's just interesting. I pose these questions because I want your guys' opinions.
I as a kid, we didn't have a lot of money, so we didn't have a lot of records. We did have some, but like all the friends, like, Forrest would buy these records and Rob would buy these records and we bought these records, me and Davi, and then, so like we kind of shared those, and then we would just make cassette tapes of all of that stuff because that's all we could do, right? And then I had a spiral notebook that if I was at Forrest's house, I would sit down. He had Can I Say? So then I sat down and wrote all the lyrics out on a page. That's I don't know that that's important to everybody because not everybody cares about lyrics.
I remember
so
I had a bootleg CDR of the SSD Kids Will Have Their Say and Get It Away, and I went to Ebullition and I asked Kent to photocopy the lyric sheets from the original record because the bootleg didn't have the lyrics, and we walked to Kinko's together and he kept on he'd photocopy all the lyrics. It was pretty cool, and it was like that shit mattered because you can't really tell what Spring is saying in a lot of those songs. So and it really mattered to me. I wanted to know what the fuck he was singing.
Yeah.
So and Kent understood like how important that shit is. So it was cool of him to do that. And I think it's cool. What were we saying?
I was going to say, how many times have you had a song on a mixtape? Like, obviously, this is dating ourselves again, fossil core to the max. But how many times did you have a song on a mixtape for ages and you thought it was saying one thing, and then when you actually got the real lyrics, you're like, oh, fuck, I am an idiot.
Yeah. Well, every single Misfits song.
Yeah. No,
you know what should happen, and hopefully this will one day, is Discogs. When you go to a record to look at a record on Discogs, why can't? Maybe sometimes people do it. No, they do. I'm at the Stains, the band that became MDC. I'm looking at their first 7-inch, and I'm flipping through the photos, and they actually do have photos of the lyric sheet itself. So that's what,
yeah,
it'd be great
it just depends on who uploads it.
Yeah,
right?
how the
And then
quality
also,
of that
how
photo.
high res it is. Because I've used Discogs a lot for that. Like, is this guy on this record? And I'll go look at it, and it's like it's so low res, like you can't read like the lyrics or whatever. But
The cool thing about that record is the B-side is a song called Born to Die. The A-side is John Wayne Was a Nazi. So the B-side's Born to Die, and the chorus is no war, no KKK, no fascist USA. And a couple of years ago, I started hearing people at protests say no Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA. And I thought, are they reciting MDC lyrics? And they are. Like MDC wrote those, like, they didn't take that from some other, protest chant. They made that shit up. And so, like, lyrics matter more than ever now, but 99.9% of people chanting that have no idea that they're actually chanting punk lyrics, but it still matters.
Totally. Any other takes on this topic before we move on?
Punk is forever.
Yeah, that's right. All right. The last thing I wanted to ask, this is another Ben question, was just what is the best hardcore punk record that was ruined or almost ruined by bad production? And Ben, let's go to you first since it was your idea.
I have a few, but I think you have one, so I'm not going to use it. There's 3 that stick out of my mind, and they're all late 80s New York hardcore records.
Well,
and I think it's
do all 3 and we can brush on them.
Okay, I think it's a coincidence because I don't think any of them were all recorded at the same place. But Bold Speak Out sounds terrible, and it's a good record. Token Entry Jaybird is a great record that sounds really bad, and Underdog Vanishing Point is the third one.
Oh, and that one sounds awful.
Yeah, and Dr. No, the guitar player of the Bad Brains, produced that Token Entry Jaybird album, and I looked him up to see what else he produced. He produced the second Scream album, This Side Up, the second Warzone album, Open Your Eyes, second Token Entry album, Jaybird, and then Warzone Sound Revolution. And that's it. Those are his credits. And all 3 of these records, mainly Token Entry and Underdog, suffer from this kind of 80s, especially the second half of the 80s, like overly reverbed out, like let's just dump reverb all over this thing to make it sound like they're playing in a big empty auditorium.
Yeah.
For some reason that'll make the record sound bigger, but it really doesn't. It just makes it sound far away. It makes it sound like it's in a cave and you're not even in the cave hearing it. You're like outside the cave, like 100 yards away. Like I hear people playing music somewhere in there, and it's just like, dude, Jaybird and the Token Entry, anyone who saw them, I didn't see them, it's not my era and it's New York, but like everyone is like, that band was amazing. And it's like, I can totally picture, Token Entry doing the fire at CB's in 80.
Yeah, but the fire's off the streets.
And people flipping out. It's the first song on Jaybird. Is it also on Beneath the Streets?
I think so. It's a fucking jam. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, it's the first song on Jaybird.
I think a lot of the music being echoey and reverby like that wouldn't stand out as being so bad if the vocals didn't sound like they were down and like a long hallway away from the actual microphone, All three of those records. Actually, Bold is just kind of a bad recording. It's not necessarily suffers from the reverb apocalypse that the other two do. But yeah, it's just a shame that that was in vogue at the time.
And here's another kind of shameful is maybe too strong of a term, but one of these records, it's either Token Entry or no, it's Underdog Vanishing Point. It's produced by Don Fury, but recorded at a studio that wasn't Don Fury's. And it's like, why didn't he just do it at his own studio? And that shit would have sounded incredible because everything at his studio sounded incredible. Like, you were already producing the record. You're like, come on, dude.
Yeah. Daniel, what's your example of this?
Well, not necessarily of this, of what Ben's describing, but Madball, Dropping Many Suckers. I think the recording is criminal. The songs are good, but Jesus Christ. And when I say the recording, I'm also including production. Like, no one was pushing Freddie for more enunciation or, those are good songs that, to me, the recording is just awful.
Yeah, luckily, like 80% of them got rescued on Set It Off.
Exactly.
And I also think comparing those two might be hurting the 7-inch a little bit. Just because like the potential because you've heard Set It Off.
Yeah, but then, arguably the production goes up and up with each album to an extent,
Yeah. With Hold It Down being near perfect, right?
Exactly. They get better and better, and they know what their sound is. Obviously, he gets better as a vocalist all the way from, so Dropping Many Suckers is his first sort of adult style vocals. Do you know what I mean? Since he was a little kid earlier. And it's just a bad recording, but yeah, those songs are saved on Set It Off, and those songs are great. It just, if you listen to them and imagine you never got Set It Off, would it have resonated as much? I don't know.
I think just because the songs are so good. And Freddie's got to be, I think, 16 on that 7-inch, somewhere around there. He's like pre-18 because he's 19 when they do the New York Hardcore documentary, which is 95.
Yeah, and the bulldog in the Pittsburgh Steelers jersey was just a puppy during Dropping Many Suckers.
Joe, what's your example of this?
I'm gonna go with probably Blood, Sweat, and No Tears, and Just Look Around. Both of those sound terrible.
I love Just Look Around.
Oh, but they're so good. Those songs are so good. I just hate that production on both of them. Just Look Around's better, but
Just Look Around is pretty pro sounding, but what is in vogue is still in vogue.
yeah.
Blood, Sweat, and No Tears is from the same recording era that of the two records Ben is talking about.
Yeah, and maybe anything else on Mystic.
Everything on Mystic.
Except for the False Confession 7-inch.
Yeah, I guess. They dodged the bullet that day.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about Mystic, we can talk about the Land of No Toilets. I mean, that guitar.
Yeah, God damn it.
It's rough.
Well, remember when you were gonna do the interview with that guy from Mystic? I was like, ask him about the reverb chamber that every band had to walk through.
He brought it up. We talked about it. Everyone check out the Philco Raves interview.
Yeah.
What's the history of that recording studio? Does that date back to the 50s and 60s, where all those Mystic bands played?
I'll get Doug Moody on and he'll lay it all out.
I have a question for Joe. The Sick of It All 7-inch on Revelation, the first one, the self-titled one where they're standing in the alleyway, all those songs were re-recorded for Blood, Sweat, and No Tears. So how would you compare?
Yeah. See, the 7-inch sounded better.
Right.
A lot of people disagree, though.
Yeah.
A lot of people love that Blood, Sweat sound.
Yeah, I love Blood, Sweat, No Tears. I think it's great. I think that Just Look Around, I think it's I don't know. Maybe it sounds a little compressed, but
It's
a lot of
super
that's
compressed. Yeah.
yeah. That's just it's just because it comes between two records that sound really bright. I think and the one before having like such a wild style, and then it kind of being maybe it's not scratched the surface yet. But those songs are so fucking good. I mean, like Just Like Around might be my favorite Sick of It All album.
It's amazing. Those songs are amazing. I'm not I'm not.
Well, that's the whole thing,
songs,
right? We're saying these are albums that we love so much and are just hurt a little bit by production.
Yeah.
I feel Just Look Around is such a dark, moody record that the production kind of reflects that. So I won't agree on that one. But yeah, the reverb thing, I would love to hear. Well, I mean, Sick of It All re-recorded a lot of Blood, Sweat, right? And I don't like any band going back and re-recording Glory Days, personally.
All right, my example is the first Integrity LP, Those Who Fear Tomorrow. I love it. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. But if they were able to get like a good heavy metal production on this album, I think it's one of the greatest heavy metal albums of all time. And I think it's like mentioned with all the great metal records of all time instead of like a game-changing hardcore record. These songs are that fucking good.
I don't think the general heavy metal public is ready for a DWID delivery of vocals like that.
Death metal's already started in '89. The bigger bands. Obviously death metal predates that, but like, Morbid Angel's '89. The first Deicide record I think is '89 or '90. Like, it's all there. I think it could have been. I think if that production's there, it's one of the greatest heavy metal records of all time. Instead, like I said, it's just one of the greatest hardcore game-changing records ever. But like, if you were to play it to like a dude that only likes heavy metal and is used to like good production, I don't think they would be able to like look past the recording.
Music is not strictly heavy metal. Like, let's say it's very well recorded. Let's say it's exactly the way you would have liked it to sound, but it's the same music, and you play it to a metalhead in '91. The music is still like, I hear Cro-Mags and Judge like in there, in addition to the kind of more metal stuff. Like, how is that metalhead going to be like, yep, sounds great? Aren't they going to be like, ew, this sounds like hardcore, I don't like it?
I don't know. I think it's more metal, personally. And I love the fact that I'm arguing to Bedge that Integrity sounds metal.
Oh, no, but I agree with you. But obviously it's a combination of metal and hardcore. And that's why I would think an average metalhead would still not like it, because it has that hardcore influence in it. Even if it's only like 30% or 40%, whatever you want to break it down.
I think that's fair. But you're coming into the 90s too, where like metal is weird. Like death metal is popping right here. Black metal is going to pop. But like in the traditional heavy metal lane, I mean, this record could have been the game changer for the entire genre if like it would have had that big production. Who knows? But this is the one I think of. And also I would have done, Vanishing Point is an interesting record. With all that reverb, it's strange to me because I think that a lot of like earlier 80s speed metal suffers from like all that reverb and
the crossover stuff.
Right, and the crossover, and so which comes from that too. Like, so it's like there just must have been an ear for it that loved how it sounded, and I think that stuff suffers from it.
I think it goes back to what I was saying about, Baroque, Romantic, all of those different things. Things come and go in vogue, just the same they do in fashion, and that sound, like, it must have been on one great record to start it all, and it was like, oh, that's the game changer. We've got to get that sound, And now look, it's being repeated. Mind Force, etc., are doing it, but in a much more tasteful level. To, they're messing around with that sound without.
But not even close.
Well, it doesn't. They've learned, like, all of those bands have learned from. Exactly, they're taking the best part of it.
Right, and that's what I think is so fascinating. That's another thing like this is our last question, but there's another thing that I think is interesting is when people take like the good lesson but get the wrong side of it. Like one thing that I think was really interesting when I interviewed Fred from False Confession was, and I was asking him about how like kind of in '86 all the Nardcore bands kind of changed or broke up or whatever, and he was saying that one of the most influential albums to a lot of people was SSD How We Rock. Like a lot of people like loved it, and like they're like, fuck, we want to play some shit like this, you know. And it's so weird because, you know, as coming generations after that, like that album is kind of like an example of what you don't want your band to do. You know, like there's nothing wrong with playing a different style of music, but I would like just break up my band and do a different style, you know? But I always thought that was so interesting that an album like that, which I consider like the wrong move, was so influential on so many people.
Yeah, I hear the Warzone Open Your Eyes LP. Like I hear the influence in that, because there's this thing that both that and How We Rock do is anytime the singer takes a breath, the lead guitarist does a wheelie, wheelie, wheelie in between every single breath the singer takes. So you have like, you know, 35 micro solos in a 2.5 minute song. And it's so like, once you are conscious of it, you can't, it ruins it. Like, you're just like, when's he going to do that solo again? Oh my God, there it is again. Like, I can't stand this. But I have a theory about the whole reverb thing in the 80s. Like, here's my understanding or my guess on how these
you mean
Token Entry and Underdog.
Your idea of it that you have convinced yourself is the God's honest truth.
I've convinced myself this is the God's honest truth. And please chime in if you think I'm way off on this.
Yeah,
so
we'll be the judge.
You be the judge of my fucking fate. Yeah. In the early 70s, Led Zeppelin did like When the Levee Breaks, and they recorded John Bonham's drums in this giant stairwell in a mansion, and they mic'd it so that you have natural reverb going upwards, and you have the, you know, those amazing drums you hear at the beginning of the Beastie Boys License to Ill album that they sampled. So you have this great sounding natural reverb on these big hard rock records in the 70s. Then by the 80s, digital reverb is invented. At some point, digital reverb is invented. I don't know when, but somewhere in the 80s, it gets used to approximate the great sounds that were being made naturally on 70s hard rock records. So now you have all these hair metal records that are just covered in digital reverb. And then you have hardcore bands that are getting on labels like Caroline and Hawker or In Effect or whatever, that are like, we want to sound legitimate. We want to sound like a real hard rock or heavy metal record from this era. Of course, now we're talking late 80s. So I guess we better use a shitload of digital reverb, because that's the way legitimate, like expensively produced records sound. And so that's my guess on why you have horrible sounding late 80s hardcore records.
Well, it's definitely a studio trick to make it sound more high budget, right? Like that's what you're going for. But Joe, what do you think about like Slayer Hell Awaits? Like, do you like how that sounds or no?
Yeah, so that's reverb a lot. I never dug it. You know, and what Ben's saying, I don't know that I don't disagree with you, Ben, but I don't think it's digital reverb. I think all that is spring in plate, you know, old school 70s reverb that some studio got, and that those studio guys have no idea how to fucking use that stuff. I think that's really what it boils down to. Is they just they don't know how to implement those devices.
Yeah, either way, it's artificial reverb. It's not bands actually playing in a giant room with echoey room. It's done in post or whatever.
But the Slayer example is what I want to talk about too, though, is just because I think it's another example of some bands like learning the wrong lesson, right? Because Hell Awaits, I don't think it sounds good. Like it's a reverb mess, you know, and those songs are amazing,
Right.
obviously, you know, but then they get it right. It's like they strip out all that reverb, and the next record is like their game-changing classic. And so I don't know why people didn't like learn that lesson of like stripping out the reverb, and you get Rain and Blood.
Well, they also got a better producer. So
well,
I know.
Ruben is
fair enough. They had a better producer that said or thought, let's take out all this fucking whack reverb.
Right.
Right. Like they didn't say, Rick, nope, we're doing the reverb. And then he like tried his best to do it. Like stripped it out, you know, and it made it better. So I don't know.
Yeah, but Show No Mercy doesn't have, you know, like that same reverb. So I think it's just the producer that thought that would be a good idea. Because I don't think it's the same producer between those.
No, I know, and I can listen to Show No Mercy. I love that record.
Yeah.
You know.
And another problem with reverb is, okay, reverb, you've got this like, you know, maybe a quarter of a second delay kind of thing, you know, where you hear the echo hit the end of the other side of a giant auditorium, or, you know, that type of sound approximated on a piece of equipment. So it works if you're playing like Led Zeppelin, like do do da do, like really slow big drum beats. But if you're playing super fast, like speed metal or hardcore, you're playing faster than the reverb hits, so it's confusing everything. Like if you ever play like fast punk, like the few times I've ever played in a really big room, it sounded terrible, and it's because you're hearing the echo hit slower than you're actually playing the beat, which is a terrible combination.
Yeah, it's why, like, you know, a hardcore band sounds not great at Ventura Theater, but if you see Blue Oyster Cult there, they sound fucking great.
Exactly.
You know. All right, well, let's wrap around. Closing thoughts, Daniel. You have anything?
No.
Cool. Joe or Ben?
I just want to throw one more thing about this reverb stuff. The other thing that changed in you know, from like 83, 84 on is the amount of squashing compression that came into popular music, and then that worked its way into underground music as well, you know, by 88, 89. So those two combinations of all that reverb and compression, it just sounds whack. So
right.
Ben, closing thoughts?
I think the reverb thing kind of it didn't die with the 80s. I think it kind of carried over into the early 90s and then finally bit it. So and I think of that compression, maybe it's a different thing. It's mastering records too loudly. That was a big problem like 10 years ago until everyone complained about it. And that was kind of like an idea of like, let's make if this record's louder than this other record, it'll sound bigger on the when played on the radio, and it like destroyed dynamics. So like bands that had really loud parts and really soft parts, it all kind of leveled out, and it sounded pretty bad. So there are these trends that end up, you know, kind of defeating themselves in the long run because they get carried into extreme territories.
Yeah, and it all hashed itself out to create the perfect album that came out December 4th, Retaliate 4. If you guys haven't picked it up, go to indecisionrecords.com and handle business, the apex of where recording has got us. And that's that. Hopefully you guys had fun here. I did. This was either a great success or a dismal failure. And everyone shoot me an email, 185milessouth@gmail.com. Let me know what you thought, or get at us at social media. I enjoyed myself. I love listening to these guys wax poetic on shit. And this is just a little bit more open-ended. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And this wasn't a total waste of your hour and a half or whatever. I'd like to do it again. So hopefully you guys enjoy it. And that's all. We'll talk to you next Monday.